An immigration officer shredded a baby's passport before his brother's eyes. Seconds later, their furious father did something so brutal it defied belief. What happened next will leave you speechless. He tore a child's passport to pieces while another officer struck his brother, certain no one would fight back. Subscribe if you believe no badge is above the law. The tearing sound was sharp, sudden, and final. Grady Vexlin didn't look up when he did it. With a bored flick of his wrist, he split the infant's passport clean down the middle and let the halves flutter to the floor like discarded trash. For a second, the airport's arrival hall seemed to fall silent. No footsteps, no rolling suitcase wheels, no overhead announcements. Just the brutal stillness of disbelief. Kalen Rivers stopped pushing the stroller. His breath caught. At 17, he had seen enough of the world to recognize disrespect, but this was something deeper. His baby brother Jorah shifted in the seat, disturbed by the tension, and let out a soft whimper. Kalen's hand tightened around the stroller's grip. His other arm instinctively reached toward the falling pieces of paper, as if he could still catch the moment before it shattered completely. Behind him, their father stood tall. Malric Rivers had the quiet presence of a man who weighed every move. His steps had been measured, his posture relaxed, but the sight of that torn document changed something. His shoulders squared slightly. Not a word left his mouth. Grady finally raised his eyes. There was something lazy and mean in them, like a man who enjoyed the small cruelty of power. He smirked, tapping his finger on the counter as if daring someone to speak. Kalen's lips parted, but before he could say anything, a hard shove slammed into his chest. Officer Darren Holt stepped in from the side, his badge gleaming under the sterile airport lights. "Back up," he barked. Without warning, he drove a fist into Kalen's stomach. The air burst out of Kalen's lungs as he folded forward, staggering against the stroller. Jorah let out a full scream now, shrill, high-pitched, terrified. People nearby turned. Some froze in place, stunned. Others glanced away quickly, pretending not to have seen, but a few pulled out their phones, angling them carefully so as not to draw attention. Malric didn't flinch. Kalen clutched the stroller's handle, struggling to breathe. The metal frame rattled beneath his grip as he forced himself upright. He locked eyes with his father for a brief second, trying to make sense of the silence. Was he waiting? Was he afraid? Number. It wasn't fear. It was something else. Grady leaned over the booth, enjoying the show. "You people really need to learn some manners," he muttered, his voice low but cruelly clear. Malric stepped forward, not with anger, not with panic, but with the controlled precision of a man drawing an invisible line. His eyes didn't flicker. He didn't look at Grady or Darren or even the forming crowd. He looked only at Kalen, then down at the stroller, where Jorah's tiny fists flailed in confusion. "Pick up the papers," Kalen gasped between breaths, trying to inject some sanity back into the moment. "That's his passport." "He's a baby." Grady chuckled and kicked one half toward a trash bin. "Then he can cry about it." From across the room, the hum of conveyor belts continued, unnoticed. Travelers wheeled their suitcases past, some glancing toward the disruption, others pretending it didn't exist. A middle-aged janitor paused beside a trash can, mop in hand, his gaze lingering on the torn papers. He looked at Malric, then at the officers. He said nothing, but a slow shake of his head betrayed the warning in his eyes. Malric's hand opened and closed at his side. His breathing remained steady. But the stillness around him had changed. It was no longer passive, it was poised. He took one more step forward, just enough to stand beside the stroller, his body now casting a long shadow across both his sons. Darren turned toward him, his stance defensive, a hand hovering near his belt. "Sir, you'll need to step back." No response. "This is an official checkpoint. Interference will not be tolerated." Malric's eyes met his. It was not a challenge, not quite, but it held the weight of a man who had once been forced to measure the cost of silence and who had now decided it was no longer acceptable. His voice, when it came, was even and calm. "You assaulted my son," Grady scoffed. "He was in the way." "Maybe don't raise him so mouthy." Jorah screamed louder. The moment crackled. Darren leaned in. "You're not going to cause a scene, are you?" Kalen straightened again, wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. His side ached, but the pain wasn't what made him tremble. It was something colder, something that came from watching the world spit on decency and dare you to react. He looked to his father. Malric's silence deepened, but his stillness was not empty. It was the tension before lightning strikes. the way trees stand before the wind breaks them. The crowd didn't know it yet. The officers didn't recognize it either. But Kalen did. So did the janitor. And perhaps even Jorah, whose cries began to slow into uncertain whimpers. This wasn't just an immigration delay. This wasn't about papers. This was a test. The officers had mistaken quiet for surrender. They thought decency meant weakness, that if they tore what was precious, no one would stop them. They were wrong. Kalen swallowed hard, his voice rasping through the tension. "Dad." Malric didn't speak, but his gaze drifted slowly down to the crushed passport and then back to Grady, and something in that stare promised reckoning. In that moment, a father's silence felt louder than thunder. The force of the punch knocked the air clean out of Kalen's lungs. Pain flared through his stomach like fire, folding him over as he stumbled back, barely keeping hold of the stroller handle. His right knee buckled, his hand tightening instinctively on the grip bar as his baby brother wailed beneath him. The wheels of the stroller jolted, inching slightly toward the edge of the painted floor line. Kalen forced his feet to stay grounded, one hand on his side, the other guarding the one thing that still mattered, Jorah. Around them, the sounds of the airport grew strangely muffled. It wasn't silence. It was something heavier, thicker. Whispers swirled like smoke around them. The low hum of conveyor belts and gate announcements faded beneath the rising tension. Several travelers stood frozen in place, unsure whether to intervene or pretend nothing had happened. A few had pulled out their phones, their screens raised discreetly but visibly, recording with trembling hands. Others turned their backs, choosing cowardice over courage. Grady's face twisted into a smirk, as if the pain he'd just ordered brought him satisfaction. He leaned forward slightly over his immigration desk, tapping a pen against the counter like a metronome of cruelty. "That's what happens when you forget your place," he muttered loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Proper respect at the border isn't optional." His tone was dripping with mockery, but the threat beneath it was unmistakable. Darren Holt, the officer who'd thrown the punch, stood tall beside him, adjusting his uniform with a grin. His knuckles were red. He cracked his neck, puffing out his chest, then took a step closer to Kalen, squaring his stance. "You gonna swing back, boy?" Darren asked, voice taunting, laced with challenge. "Come on, make my day." Kalen's jaw tightened. The fire in his gut was matched only by the heat rising to his cheeks, not just from pain, but humiliation. Yet even as his breath came in shaky draws, he didn't move. His eyes didn't meet Darren's. They slid to the left, to the man who had not yet spoken a word. Malric Rivers stood 3 paces behind, silent and unmoving. His face was unreadable, carved in stone. To anyone else it might have seemed like indifference. But Kalen knew better. He had seen that look before, once, years ago, when a drunk man had threatened their family in a parking lot. Back then, his father had stood the same way. Calm, still, silent. That night ended with the man in the hospital and the police calling it justified self-defense. Kalen swallowed, still bent over slightly, shielding Jorah with his body. His side throbbed, but something inside him knew. His father wasn't waiting out of fear. He was calculating. He was measuring the moment, weighing what would come next. Darren scoffed at the lack of response. He leaned in further, pointing a finger in Kalen's face. "Thought so." "All bark." "No. Careful." The word came like a razor through velvet. It was Malric. The single word halted Darren mid-sentence. Heads turned. Even Grady blinked, caught off guard. There was no loud threat in the tone, no raised voice, but the silence that followed it was colder than any scream could have been. Malric didn't move. He simply watched as his son clutched his ribs, as his infant whimpered in fear, as 2 men in uniform tested the limits of power. His shoulders remained relaxed. His hands were still at his sides, but there was something in his gaze, something ancient and sharp, a warning written in silence. Darren hesitated. He glanced at Grady, unsure now. The punch had been meant to intimidate. The smirk was supposed to make the father flinch, but Malric hadn't even blinked. Across the hall, the janitor paused mid-sweep. His name tag read Relin, and the lines in his face spoke of years spent in quiet observation. He leaned on his mop and watched the unfolding scene with narrowed eyes. He had seen things before, ugly things, and this wasn't going to end the way the officers expected. He whispered to no one in particular, voice low and almost reverent. "They don't realize what they've just woken." Grady kicked the torn halves of the baby's passport toward the trash bin with a lazy flick of his boot, the thin paper fluttering briefly before landing inches short of the can. He smirked, his chin raised in quiet triumph, his voice loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Guess he's not going anywhere now," he muttered with feigned indifference, as if reducing a child's identity to garbage was a part of his daily routine. At that moment, Darren Holt surged forward. Without warning, he grabbed 17-year-old Kalen Rivers by the front of his jacket and slammed him back against the metal divider separating immigration lanes. The harsh clang rang across the arrival hall, turning heads, drawing gasps. Jorah, still in his stroller, shrieked louder, his cries raw with panic and confusion. Kalen winced in pain, his hand instinctively reaching out, not for defense but to steady the stroller, to protect the fragile infant his arms had held all night. Darren's breath came hot and close, his face tight with smug authority. "Control your brother before we control him for you," he snarled, as if Kalen's very presence was an insult. Kalen, pressed between the officer and the cold metal barrier, struggled for air, his lips parted but silent. He searched for his father with wide eyes, not for help, but for a signal. A clue. A cue. Malric Rivers didn't speak at first. He stepped forward with quiet purpose, the soft soles of his shoes echoing faintly over the polished floor. His face betrayed nothing. No panic, no rage, just a calm that seemed foreign in the chaos. A quiet so complete that it made people pause. Behind him, conversations dimmed. Nearby, passengers froze, phones lifted in trembling hands. The tension crackled like electricity in the air. "Release him," Malric said. His voice wasn't loud, it wasn't angry, but it carried. It cut through the sound of crying, through the thick noise of authority gone wrong. Darren glanced over his shoulder and laughed, jerking Kalen once more against the barrier as if to punctuate his defiance. "You want me to release him?" he scoffed, turning his body slightly toward Malric. "You think you're in charge here?" But he'd already made a mistake. The moment his attention wavered, Malric moved. It was not a wild attack. It was trained, fluid, deliberate. His hand snapped forward, gripping Darren's wrist with force that didn't come from rage, it came from precision. In one swift motion, he twisted the officer's arm outward, bending it past its natural range. Darren let out a sharp grunt, his body lurching sideways. Malric stepped in, using Darren's own momentum to drive him backward and into the edge of his desk with a loud crash. The room gasped in unison. Darren's back hit the surface with such force that it knocked over a stack of immigration forms and a small desk fan, which clattered to the ground, spinning uselessly. He slumped to the floor, groaning, eyes wide in disbelief. His weapon remained in its holster, untouched. He hadn't even seen the blow coming. Grady took a half-step back. His smirk faded into a flicker of uncertainty. His hand hovered near his baton, fingers twitching. He locked eyes with Malric, expecting the man to press forward, to strike again. But Malric didn't move. He stood upright, arms loose at his sides, but eyes sharp and locked on Grady with a quiet intensity that stopped the officer cold. The crowd, once scattered in motion, stood still as if frozen in time. Even the humming conveyors and security alarms in the background seemed quieter under the weight of what had just unfolded. Kalen stumbled forward, holding his side, still catching his breath. But he didn't speak. He didn't need to. His eyes stayed on his father, and in that gaze was understanding. This wasn't over. This was the beginning. Grady's mouth curled back into something uncertain, his pride fighting against the creeping sense of fear now spreading through his limbs. "You're going to regret that," he muttered, louder than intended, trying to reassert command over the moment. Malric didn't reply. He didn't need to. The air around him spoke louder than words. It was in the set of his shoulders, the stillness of his posture, the cold calculation in his stare. This was no longer a tired traveler asking for fair treatment. This was a father pushed beyond the edge of patience, and every man in the room, Grady, Darren, the guards watching from behind their glass enclosures, knew instinctively that something had shifted. Somewhere near the back of the hall, a janitor paused mid-sweep, his eyes fixed on the unfolding scene. His whisper was barely audible over the crowd, but it reached a few ears. "They don't know who they just woke up." Grady stiffened, puffing his chest as if trying to deny the shift in power. But his eyes flicked nervously toward the crowd gathering, to the phones raised, to the toddler still crying in the stroller. Authority once assumed now felt dangerously fragile. Malric took one slow step forward, not aggressive, not threatening, just present. Grady flinched slightly, his hand twitching once more near his belt, But still, Malric didn't move to strike. He only stared. And that silence, controlled, steady, unblinking, was more terrifying than any shout or punch. The balance of power in the room had tilted, and everyone watching knew it. This wasn't about a torn passport anymore. It wasn't even about a punch or a shove. This had become something else entirely, something primal, something righteous. And as the moment held its breath, the foreshadowing hung heavy in the air. This was no longer about papers. It was about power. Grady's hand shot to his belt. With a sharp crack, he slammed his baton down against the metal counter, the sound slicing through the terminal like a thunderclap. Conversations fell silent. A baby's soft gurgle stuttered into stillness. Travelers froze mid-step, eyes turning instinctively toward the sound. The baton strike wasn't meant for combat. It was a declaration. Grady's glare swept across the room, and then he barked out toward two uniformed guards idling near the second carousel. Code 9, Terminal 2. Now his voice echoed with urgency and arrogance, as if daring anyone to question his authority. The guards stiffened and began advancing. Malric Rivers stepped forward, not a lunge, not a charge, a measured stride. Each motion carried weight, not just in his tall, disciplined frame, but in something deeper, a stillness forged in storms. He moved with the grace of experience, not instinct. A man who had waded through worse before acting. Kalen, bruised but alert, stood behind his father. His ribs ached from the earlier blow, but he clung tightly to the stroller's handle as if his grip alone could keep his baby brother safe from the world unraveling around them. Jorah whimpered softly beneath the navy-blue blanket, sensing the shift in the air. Malric glanced sideways only for a heartbeat, just long enough to see his son standing firm. He didn't speak, but in the quiet space between them, a message passed. "Stay behind me." Across the room, a businessman in a charcoal suit leaned closer to his phone. The red recording light blinked as he whispered to a stranger beside him, "This is going viral in 5 minutes." Grady noticed it too. His jaw clenched. What had begun as routine humiliation was spiraling fast, and the presence of cameras now tilted the scale in ways he hadn't accounted for. But still, he believed he had control. "Get back in line," Grady growled, his baton now pointed toward Malric's chest like a spear. "This doesn't have to escalate." Malric's hands were open, calm at his sides. His voice, when it came, was cool and quiet. "Then don't escalate it." A flicker of something passed through Grady's eyes, uncertainty maybe, but it vanished behind pride. "You think you're in charge here?" he spat, stepping closer. The distance between them was now measured in heartbeats. Malric didn't move. Behind him, the guards Grady had summoned were drawing near, their hands hovering near tasers. One of them, a younger man with the sweat pooling under his collar, hesitated. The other, broader and older, looked more eager, unaware of the force he was walking into. And all around them, the terminal waited, hushed. Travelers with bags half unzipped, families with boarding passes forgotten in hand, airport staff peeking from behind service desks. The airport had become a stage, and Malric, still and unblinking, stood at its center. He was not reckless. He had known men like Grady, men who carried uniforms like armor and wielded rules like weapons, men who mistook silence for surrender and composure for cowardice, men who had never been tested by anything real. But Malric had, and the irony, heavy and bitter, pressed into the space like humidity. Grady believed he was still in control, believed that authority came from lanyards and metal batons and raised voices. He didn't realize that control had already slipped from his fingers, lost the moment he laid a hand on Kalen, the moment he tore a child's passport like it was nothing more than paper. Kalen shifted slightly, the motion stiff from pain but filled with resolve. He glanced down at his baby brother, whose eyes fluttered open for a moment before closing again in soft distress. He would remember this, not in images, perhaps, but in feeling. And Kalen was determined that feeling would not be fear. "Dad," Kalen murmured, voice tight. Malric raised one hand slightly, not to strike, not to block, but as if touching the edge of an invisible line. He didn't speak, but the movement halted Kalen's worry. It was a promise. Grady's knuckles whitened around the baton. Another step forward. "I said," he barked, "back." And then something flickered in Malric's gaze. Not anger, not even rage, just awareness. The kind that came before a storm, when even the birds go quiet. The guards behind Grady moved faster now, boots striking rhythm against the tile. Tension thickened the air. Somewhere across the hall, a child began to cry. A luggage carousel screeched to life with a groan of metal and spinning belts, but no one turned to look. Everyone's eyes were on the unfolding moment. A second too late, Grady realized the balance had shifted. The crowd no longer watched with curiosity. They watched with judgment. And Malric, calm, measured, focused, had become the axis upon which the story turned. One of the guards reached for his baton. Malric didn't move, but the silence between motion was louder than any shout. "They think they're in control," the businessman whispered again, his phone shaking slightly now. "But they're not." And just then, as if the universe itself had been holding its breath, the baton Grady held trembled slightly in his grasp. The storm was already inside the room. They just hadn't felt the rain yet. The first guard reinforcement barely made it 5 steps into the scene before Malric Rivers acted. Without hesitation, Malric's right hand shot forward like a piston, catching the guard's incoming arm at the elbow and twisting it sharply. The guard's baton clattered to the floor as Malric pivoted, using the man's own momentum to drive him into his approaching partner. The two officers stumbled into each other and crashed hard against the metal queue railing. A chorus of gasps rose from the crowd. Chaos surged through the hall like a breaking tide. Kalen Rivers, his side still aching from the earlier punch, ignored the pain and lunged toward the wall, dragging Jorah's stroller with him. His body curved protectively around his baby brother, instinct overriding fear. He looked up just in time to see Grady Vexlin charging forward like a bull, baton raised high, eyes wild with fury. "Enough!" Grady roared, his voice cutting through the noise, but his swing came too late. Malric turned, his body moving with deliberate precision, years of discipline flowing through every muscle. His hand snapped up, intercepting the descending baton. The force of the blow should have staggered any ordinary man, but Malric held his ground, his arm steady. For one suspended second, their eyes met. Grady's full of disbelief, Malric's unreadable, cold. Then, with a swift jerk and a twist of both hands, Malric wrenched the weapon from Grady's grasp. The metal baton groaned under the pressure, then cracked. It split into 2 jagged pieces, one falling near Grady's boot, the other bouncing across the polished tiles like a judgment rendered. Silence slammed down over the arrival hall. All sound, footsteps, announcements, the buzz of fluorescent lights seemed to vanish. Even Jorah, moments ago wailing from his stroller, fell quiet. The fragments of the broken baton rolled to a stop, one resting beside a dropped boarding pass, the other beneath a bench where an elderly man sat frozen with his mouth agape. Darren Holt, still on the floor from Malric's earlier defense of his son, stopped mid-crawl. His jaw slackened at the sight. The laughter and arrogance that had once burned in his expression dissolved into something else. Uncertainty. Malric didn't look at him. He stood in the center of the chaos, his shoulders squared, his hands lowered at his sides, but every tendon and fiber coiled like a storm held back only by a breath. The expression on his face wasn't rage. It was control. Terrifying, unwavering control. "You tore paper," Malric said, his voice a razor's edge. Grady staggered backward. What are you?" "I warned you not to touch blood." His words dropped like stones into a still pond, sending ripples through the gathered crowd. A teenage boy holding his phone dropped it, unable to look away. A middle-aged man in a business suit whispered under his breath, "Did you get that?" to no one in particular. Nearby, a janitor halted mid-sweep, leaning on his broom like it was a staff of ancient wisdom. The air itself had changed, no longer just tense but charged, as if the walls of Drenwick International had shifted their shape and purpose. This was no longer a terminal. It was a reckoning ground. Malric's breathing remained calm, slow, but his presence commanded the space in ways uniforms never could. His stance wasn't aggressive, but it was unignorable. Authority flowed from him, not given, not asked for, but earned through experience that none of the officers could read, and all of them now feared. Grady's fingers hovered near his sidearm, but hesitation flashed across his face. He knew what that move would invite, and for the first time, he seemed unsure whether the badge on his chest could protect him from the truth in Malric's eyes. That truth said, "If you force me, I will not hesitate." Kalen, crouched behind the stroller, watched with wide, unblinking eyes. His heart pounded, not from fear, but awe. The man before him wasn't just his father, he was a force, a protector carved from steel and silence. And now the world could see it too. Darren made no move. His hand hovered near his own belt, but something, Perhaps the weight of earlier arrogance or the clarity of fear held him back. A shift rolled through the terminal. The balance of power had tilted, not because of how hard Malric had hit, but because of what he had not done yet. That restraint, that composure, it spoke louder than any strike, and everyone watching understood one thing. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Behind the security desk, a blinking red light flashed where a silent alarm had been triggered. Somewhere in the building, more officers would be coming, but Malric stood tall, unmoved by the threat. For a heartbeat longer, no one dared to breathe. The jagged baton halves lay still. The crowd waited, phones ready, questions buzzing unspoken in the air. And then came the line that would echo through social media posts, headlines, and courtroom testimonies in the days to follow. The line that would crystallize the moment forever. Malric's voice, steady and low, carved through the silence once more. "You tore paper. I warned you not to touch blood." The crowd shivered, sensing that what came next would change the story forever. The real fight had only just begun. The broken baton rolled across the polished tiles, spinning slowly before clattering to a stop near the foot of a startled traveler. Its echo lingered like a warning bell, cutting through the chaos with eerie clarity. For a moment, the entire arrival hall held its breath. Grady's smirk faltered as the reality before him shifted. His hand twitched near his holster, not yet drawing, but dancing on the edge of decision. His nostrils flared. The false confidence he wore like a uniform was cracking. Malric didn't move. His stance remained steady, feet planted, chest rising and falling with calm precision. His eyes were locked onto Grady, not with fear, not even with anger, but with the cold clarity of a man who had already made peace with what he might need to do. He didn't blink. He didn't speak. His silence was louder than a battle cry. Behind him, Kalen gripped the stroller so tightly his knuckles turned pale. Jorah wailed softly, the kind of cry that sounded not just from hunger or discomfort, but from sensing something broken in the air around him. Kalen crouched slightly, shielding his brother with his body, whispering, "It's okay, I've got you," though the tremble in his voice betrayed his own fear. His ribs ached from the earlier blow, but he held his ground. 3 officers stood frozen mid-step, caught between Grady's barked orders and the raw truth unraveling before them. These were not the actions of a violent man. Malric's movements were calculated, deliberate, and above all, controlled. There was no frenzy in his defense, only purpose. A ripple moved through the crowd. A businessman near the coffee kiosk raised his phone higher. A young man in a hoodie whispered, "He didn't even flinch," to no one in particular. An elderly man sitting near the luggage carousel muttered, "Mark my words, this ain't gonna be hidden." Each passerby, each witness, transformed into something more, a silent jury. Grady tried to speak, but the words caught in his throat. When they did escape, they carried no weight. "This man is resisting. He assaulted officers." His voice cracked at the end. It sounded defensive now, not authoritative. He looked around as if to rally support, but the eyes around him no longer reflected loyalty. They reflected doubt. Malric took a single step forward, not aggressively, but deliberately. The shuffle of his boot against the floor echoed louder than Grady's shouting. Darren groaned behind them, pushing himself upright from the floor. His lip was split, his cheek already purpling. Still, pride burned in his eyes like coals fanned too long. He spat on the ground and snarled, "You'll regret this." His words slithered out through clenched teeth, but they held no power. Not anymore. Even he could feel it, the shift, the weight pressing against him, the weight of being seen. Kalen stood, fists still balled, eyes darting from his father to the guards to the forming crowd. For the first time, he saw his father not just as a protector, but as something deeper, something forged in silence, shaped by decades of watching injustice and knowing precisely when to strike. Every lesson whispered at bedtime, every warning to be still, be calm, be ready, they all clicked into place. "Sir," one of the younger guards stammered, stepping slightly back, looking from Malric to Grady. "Should we stand down?" His voice trembled under the pressure of conscience and protocol. Grady snapped, "No one moves until I say so." But his voice had lost its grip. It bounced off tile and glass, landing flat and ignored. Malric's gaze hadn't shifted. Still on Grady. Still unreadable. The bystanders were no longer mere observers. Their phones were eyes for the world, and their silence was louder than any chant. They were not shouting yet. They didn't need to. The atmosphere itself was speaking. One officer stepped forward, hand on his baton, but his motion was hesitant. Malric did not respond. He didn't raise his fists. He didn't threaten. His stillness was its own message. I will not be provoked, but I will not be bowed. Another step. Another moment. The tension thickened, slow and suffocating. Grady's fingers grazed the snap of his holster. His breath hitched. He was used to power being a uniform, a badge, a desk to sit behind. But now, stripped of crowd control, stripped of authority, all that remained was a man who had just lost the room. Behind the immigration booths, the low hum of radios began to buzz. New reinforcements called in, voices thick with urgency. But they would arrive too late. The story was already out. Kalen glanced toward the blinking red light of a security camera tucked near the exit. He prayed someone in the control room was watching, that someone would make this moment matter. Darren took another step, but even his boots sounded unsure now. He looked toward Grady for direction, but the man offered none. Only a twitching hand and eyes that could no longer mask fear. Grady's voice cracked again, weaker this time. You'll be arrested. Mark my words. Still, Malric didn't speak. He didn't need to. His silence filled the space like thunderclouds over a dry field. Darren's breath quickened. This isn't over. And then Malric finally moved, not with violence, but with intent. He turned slightly, shielding his sons with his body, never breaking eye contact with the man who had started it all. The echo of the baton's fall still seemed to linger. The hall had transformed into a courtroom, and Malric was both witness and verdict. A baton sliced through the air. Malric Rivers tilted his head just enough for it to whistle past his ear, his body already moving in response. The guard who swung it, a younger man with nervous energy and too much blind confidence, never saw the counter coming. With a smooth, practiced motion, Malric ducked low and swept his leg out, hooking behind the man's knees. The guard collapsed hard against the polished airport floor, arms flailing, baton clattering across the tiles. Another officer charged from the side, face twisted in determination, radio still clipped to his vest. Malric shifted weight onto his back foot, pivoted, and used the man's momentum against him. He redirected him into the nearest metal detector gate, the man crashing shoulder first into the structure. The entire frame shuddered before toppling sideways with a screeching groan. The sound echoed across the terminal like a crashing wave, and alarms blared to life, their wails slicing through the chaos like emergency sirens in a tunnel. Passengers screamed, phones flew into the air. Some people ducked behind benches, others fled toward terminal exits. But many stayed, rooted in place by disbelief, fear, and something else. Awe. Kalen Rivers, his ribs still aching from the earlier punch, stood protectively over the stroller, his stance braced. He gritted his teeth against the pain but lifted his voice, strong and clear, over the confusion. Everyone stay back. Stay out of the way. His voice didn't crack. It boomed. He didn't recognize it as his own. Jorah whimpered softly in the stroller, tiny fists curling around the edge of his blanket. His cries, once sharp and desperate, began to soften, as if even the infant sensed his father's presence was shifting the tides. Malric's chest rose and fell with deliberate calm. His mind wasn't racing, it was focused. Everything else blurred. The shouting, the rushing feet, the alarms, they became background noise. All he saw now was movement, position, and threat. Years of discipline, once buried beneath a quiet life of fatherhood and day jobs, surged to the surface with terrifying clarity. But the threat wasn't over. Grady Vexlin, red-faced and humiliated, stormed through the chaos like a man possessed. His fists were clenched. His belt was twisted from the scuffle. One holster flap snapped open. He looked less like an officer and more like a man fighting to reclaim a crumbling illusion of control. "You don't get to humiliate me," Grady bellowed, and then he charged. Malric didn't step back. He braced his body just enough to absorb the impact as Grady's shoulder slammed into his chest. The force knocked both men backward, stumbling and twisting as they collided with the tile floor in a tangle of limbs. A collective gasp erupted from the onlookers, and the camera phones swayed as the crowd surged forward, capturing every breathless second. The two men wrestled on the floor, their struggle brutal but calculated. Grady swung wild, his punches driven more by rage than technique. Malric moved with measured economy, blocking, redirecting, countering. A fist grazed his cheek. Another thudded into his shoulder. But he absorbed the hits like a man used to pain, channeling every ounce of his strength into restraint. Malric wasn't trying to win. He was trying to end it. Grady grunted, trying to pin Malric's wrist. "You're finished. You hear me?" he hissed, spittle flying. "I'll have your kids taken." "I'll have." Malric's arm snapped free. He grabbed Grady's elbow, twisted it up and behind his back, and drove the man's chest down toward the ground. The groan that escaped Grady's throat was guttural, animalistic. Across the room, more guards hesitated, uncertain. Every officer who had rushed in now paused mid-step, caught between commands and the evidence unraveling before their eyes. This wasn't the scene they expected. This wasn't the man they thought they could corner. And among them, Kalen stood tall, bruised but unflinching. His hands tightened into fists. He didn't move toward the fight. He didn't need to. He was already part of it, his courage holding the line in silence. He glanced at Jorah, who now blinked up at the ceiling, his eyes calm. Something unspoken passed through the air between father and sons, a sense of unity forged through fire. From the floor, Grady thrashed, trying to twist out of Malric's grip. "You think this makes you a hero?" he spat. "You think they'll believe you?" Malric didn't answer. He didn't need to, because all around them, dozens of phones remained fixed on the scene, blinking red, capturing every detail. A ripple of whispers spread through the spectators. Some were crying, some stood in silent defiance, and some simply stared, overwhelmed by the storm they had just witnessed. The fight was still in motion, blows still being exchanged, but something in the air had shifted. The control Grady believed he had was gone. The authority the badge once offered had melted beneath the weight of truth, force, and exposure. And in every strike, every block, every breath Malric took, he was not just defending his sons. He was reclaiming dignity. Every blow landed was more than physical. It was a war of dignity. He thought humiliating a black family at the border would go unanswered. But justice doesn't stay silent. If you believe every act of cruelty must be answered, hit subscribe. Justice starts here. Malric's cheek pressed cold against the terminal floor, the smell of disinfectant and panic thick in his nose. The weight of Grady's body bore down on him, but only for a second. Instinct took over, instinct forged through years of disciplined training, sharpened by the quiet rage of a father pushed too far. With a surge of strength, Malric shifted his weight, locking his elbow beneath Grady's torso and rolling with controlled precision. In one swift motion, he reversed the hold. Grady grunted in surprise as he was flipped onto his back. Malric's knee pinned his shoulder as his hand clamped around the officer's wrist. The crowd leaned in, a collective gasp rising like a wave. Then, crack. The sound echoed, sharp and final, as Grady's arm bent at an unnatural angle. He screamed, the cry tearing through the tense air like a siren. The hall, once filled with orders and chaos, went still for a breathless moment. Travelers froze mid-step, phones held steady in trembling hands. Even the airport intercom paused, as if reluctant to interrupt what was unfolding. From the corner of Malric's eye, motion flickered. Darren Holt, face twisted with rage and humiliation, charged forward like a bull in uniform. His steps pounded against the tile, baton raised, teeth clenched. But before he could close the gap, Kalen Rivers moved. The teenager was bruised, his shirt wrinkled from being shoved, one arm cradling his side where the earlier punch had landed. But his steps were steady as he stepped between Darren and the stroller. His legs wobbled only slightly as he planted himself in the officer's path, arms outstretched. "You're not getting past me," Kalen said, voice strained but steady. Darren faltered, the baton in his hand hovering mid-air. His breath caught for a moment as he looked down at the boy who dared to stand against him. His sneer returned, but it lacked conviction. "Move," he barked, but his tone had lost its edge. Kalen didn't move. He didn't blink. Behind him, Jorah whimpered softly, still nestled in the stroller, unaware of how close danger had come. Kalen shifted his weight slightly, shielding the stroller with his own body, as if willing himself to become a wall. Malric watched this from the corner of his vision, his body still pressing down on Grady's twisted form. Pride and pain swelled together in his chest. His son's courage wasn't just bravery, it was proof that all the quiet lessons, all the discipline, all the long talks about restraint and honor had taken root. Kalen wasn't fearless, but he refused to yield. That refusal carried more power than any weapon. Grady writhed beneath Malric's knee, trying to twist away, but his strength was draining fast. "Get off me," he spat, voice cracking. But his authority was gone. He could feel it in the silence of the crowd, in the way his own men hesitated, unsure of who truly held command anymore. "Enough," Malric said, his voice quiet but firm, eyes never leaving Grady's pale face. "You don't get to hurt my sons and walk away like it means nothing." The baton Darren held now felt heavier in his hand. The boy in front of him, just a teenager, a child, really, wasn't armed, wasn't trained, and yet something about the way Kalen stood made Darren hesitate. A beat passed, then another. Behind him, the terminal echoed with murmurs and the sound of 100 witnesses who would not forget what they had seen. "You don't want this," Kalen said, voice softer now but full of something undeniable. "You already lost." Darren blinked. The words hit like stones. He took one step back, unsure, his grip loosening on the baton. Malric shifted again, tightening his hold on Grady's wrist. "You made a choice when you tore that passport," he said slowly, each word heavy. "You made another when you hit my son. You don't get to walk away from that without facing the consequences." Grady tried to struggle again, but Malric pressed down, the tension in his arms rising. The crowd, silent now, watched with bated breath. Some flinched. Others couldn't look away. Kalen held his ground, jaw clenched, shoulders squared. Then the final sound came. A low, sharp snap, Grady's spine giving way beneath Malric's grip. His scream was hoarse, filled with more than pain. It was the cry of a man who had just realized the full cost of his arrogance. The crowd didn't cheer. They didn't speak. They simply stared. A silence deeper than any before settled over the terminal, thick and absolute. For one still second, time itself seemed frozen. The lights buzzed overhead. The alarms in the distance flickered. Somewhere, a suitcase tumbled off a cart and clattered against the wall. But none of it mattered, because on that floor, a father had drawn the line. And as Malric loosened his hold, as Kalen stepped back toward the stroller, as Darren stood frozen in place, one truth lingered in the air like smoke from a fire that could no longer be hidden. The line between justice and vengeance grew thinner with every breath. "Stand down!" The command tore through the chaos like a blade, sharp and impossible to ignore. Every head in the arrival hall turned toward the voice. At the far end of the room, framed by flashing alarms and flickering overhead lights, stood a man with a rigid frame and eyes carved by years of duty. Lieutenant Corvin Strass. His uniform bore the insignia of command, but it was his presence, quiet yet unmistakably resolute, that made the shouts momentarily falter. Malric Rivers did not release his grip. Grady Vexlin, face flushed and locked beneath Malric's hand, tried to rise, his boots scraping against the tile in frantic, useless resistance. But Malric held him fast, arm twisted, spine bent, the weight of a father's fury pressing down like judgment itself. Around them, the crowd surged in nervous energy, phones still recording, gasps rippling like wind through leaves. The echo of the snapped baton still lingered faintly in the background like a dying heartbeat. Strass stepped forward, his boots deliberate on the floor, hands out in a measured gesture of control. "Everyone, officers included, stand down. Now." But the uniform no longer held full power. Not here, not after what the crowd had witnessed. Some of the guards hesitated, caught between the command they were trained to obey and the reality unfolding before them, a reality where uniforms no longer meant righteousness, and silence had already done enough damage. Malric's breathing was calm but deep, his fingers steady around Grady's shoulder. His face didn't show rage, but something far colder, resolved, focused. Every inch of him radiated a kind of still fury that unnerved even the most hardened officers nearby. Grady let out a strangled growl, more humiliation than pain. "Get him off me," he snarled toward the nearest guard, his voice laced with desperation. "He's gone mad. He broke my arm." But no one moved, not even Darren Holt, who lingered to the side, one eye swelling, the other flitting nervously between Strass and the crowd. His baton had long been dropped. His pride now hung lower than his head. Strass stepped closer, careful not to escalate with sudden movements. He had seen violence before, decades of it. But this was different. This wasn't senseless aggression. This was consequence. His eyes met Malric's, and in that look, recognition passed, not of names, but of lives shaped by the same furnace. Discipline, sacrifice, the weight of authority, and the knowledge of when a man had crossed a line that could not be uncrossed. Strass's voice softened but didn't lose command. I know what happened here. But I need you to let him go." Malric's eyes narrowed. Not in resistance, but in calculation. Behind him, he could hear Kaelin shifting slightly, drawing the stroller further back, shielding baby Jorah from view. Somewhere in the background, another officer clicked his radio, whispering for higher command. But the energy in the room told everyone that control no longer belonged to them. "You warned him," Malric said quietly. His voice was low, but it carried to every corner of the terminal. "Didn't you?" Strass didn't answer immediately. The question wasn't really for him. It was for the system that had looked the other way, for the reports that had been filed and ignored, for the patterns of behavior that had been tolerated until they cracked something that could not be repaired. "I did," Strass finally said, his words bitter with truth. It was only a matter of time. The irony hung in the air like smoke. All those silent warnings, all the unfiled complaints, the quiet shuffles from one shift to another to avoid scandal. And now, here it was, laid bare in front of dozens of travelers, captured by 100 cameras, painted in bruises and broken protocol. Malric didn't move yet. His grip held, but not out of vengeance. It was precision, ensuring that Grady didn't slip free, didn't vanish behind bureaucracy and cover-up. His voice returned, firmer this time. "He tore my son's passport, struck my older boy, mocked the infant crying in that stroller." He tilted his head, his tone sharpening with each syllable. "You think this is about a scuffle? About some video going viral?" He leaned in closer to Grady, who now trembled beneath the weight of every second. His voice dropped into a whisper that still carried to those listening. "It's about what happens when you mistake silence for permission." Strass swallowed, not out of fear, but out of the heavy truth sinking in around them all. He had tried to contain the fire before it reached this point, but no one had listened. Behind them, the other officers stood frozen, unsure of whose command to follow, protocol or justice. And the crowd didn't move, they simply watched. Phones still raised, eyes still wide. Malric finally spoke again, not to Strass this time, but to everyone. His voice was steady, as if carved in stone. "You tore his papers, you struck my son. Now you face a father's judgment." The hall held its breath, waiting to see if justice would roar or whisper. Grady writhed beneath Malric's grip, his uniform bunching up beneath Malric's knuckles as the older man pinned him hard to the cold tile. His face, once carved with arrogance and contempt, now twisted with pain and disbelief. Every attempt to squirm free only worsened the pressure on his spine. The gleam of superiority had vanished from his eyes, replaced by something foreign, fear. Around them, the terminal had transformed into a surreal arena. Dozens of travelers had dropped their luggage, their hands now raised not in alarm, but in solidarity. Phones captured every detail: the torn passport by the desk, the broken baton near the trash bin, Kaelin hunched protectively near the stroller, and Malric, towering, unmoving, controlled like a storm trapped inside glass. The low blare of the alarm system pulsed through the air, underscoring the chaos with a mechanical heartbeat. Lieutenant Strass's voice pierced the commotion. "Back up to Gate 7, now!" But the echo of his command drowned beneath the rising murmur of the crowd. No one moved. The guards nearby hesitated, their eyes flickering between Grady's broken posture and Malric's steady resolve. It was no longer just a security breach. It was a reckoning. Darren, still seething from earlier, lunged forward without waiting for orders. His boots squealed across the tile as he charged. But Kaelin, moving on instinct alone, pushed the stroller out of harm's way and stepped into his father's shadow. His fists trembled, not from fear, but from the adrenaline coursing through his aching ribs. He didn't shout, he didn't flinch. He simply stood there, a silent challenge carved into the shape of a boy who refused to be ignored. Malric glanced sideways, just a flicker of the eye, and met Kaelin's gaze. There was pain there, yes, but deeper still was pride. The kind that rooted men to the ground when everything around them threatened to collapse. Darren slowed, momentarily startled by the boy's boldness. His steps faltered. He wasn't ready for this. He wasn't ready to be the villain in a scene where the world was watching. For a heartbeat, his body language betrayed him, shoulders slackened, footfalls uncertain, and that hesitation cost him his momentum. Malric turned his focus back to the man beneath him. "You thought paper was power," he said, his voice like gravel dragged across steel. It wasn't a shout, yet it rang across the terminal like a verdict. His hand shifted, firm and deliberate, locking Grady's wrist in place against the floor. Grady grunted, his legs kicking weakly, but the power dynamic had already shifted. This wasn't a struggle anymore. It was judgment. Malric's muscles tensed, shoulders broadening as he pulled up slightly on Grady's arm, leveraging his body with terrifying control. Grady's face twisted again, his breath catching, his pride unraveling in real time. Kalen stepped closer, standing between Darren and the stroller now, drawing the line even clearer. The air had thickened, as though everyone present was holding their breath at once. "You hurt my son," Malric continued, his voice low but deadly calm. "You tore my child's passport like it meant nothing. You struck a boy and mocked his brother's cries." The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was full of eyes watching, of hearts pounding, of histories remembered. Malric shifted his grip again. The movement was fluid, almost graceful in its simplicity, and yet so full of consequence. His arms tightened. The sound that followed was not loud, but it was absolute. A dull, sickening crack rang out as Grady's spine gave way. He didn't scream, at least not right away. His mouth opened in a silent cry before the pain found its voice. A stifled howl escaped him as he collapsed beneath the weight of his own undoing. His limbs twitched involuntarily, the authority he once carried vanishing like breath on glass. Everything stopped. The alarms still screamed. The phones still recorded. The guards still stood. But in that moment, just after the crack, just before the fallout, it felt as if the world itself had stopped turning. Even Lieutenant Strass, who had pushed through men to reach the scene, stood frozen at the sight. His outstretched hand, meant to command or calm, hung limply by his side now, as he watched the consequences of negligence made flesh and fury. Kalen's eyes darted between his baby brother, now quietly sniffling in the stroller, and his father, who still knelt over the defeated officer. His breath shook as he inhaled, shoulders rising, but his stance never wavered. The bruises on his ribs throbbed, but the heat in his chest, the quiet fury ignited by watching injustice, burned brighter than the pain. Across the room, someone whispered, "He did it." Another said, "They're going to bury this." But more and more voices joined the first. "Keep filming. He was defending his kids. That man tore the passport. They started it." Malric finally stood. Not quickly. Not to run. He stood as a man does when he's finished carrying out something necessary. He adjusted his jacket with care, then turned to his sons. Kalen was already beside the stroller, repositioning it gently, watching his father not with fear, but reverence. Malric placed a hand on Jorah's small head, brushing sweat and curls away from the boy's forehead. Then he looked up, calm as ever. He spoke not to the officers, nor the cameras, but to the moment itself, as if it were a thing that could listen and remember. "You thought paper was power. Let me show you what blood is." With a single decisive movement, he twisted harder, the sound of Grady's spine giving way, freezing every witness in place. The silence afterward was louder than any scream. For a brief moment, the airport stood still, as if even time itself was afraid to move. The sound of Grady's spine snapping echoed for a split second before silence seized the terminal like a held breath. The very air felt frozen, thick with disbelief. Then chaos erupted. Dozens of officers surged forward from both sides of the hall, their boots hammering the tile floor, weapons drawn in confusion and panic. But before they could reach the center of the confrontation, something unexpected happened. The crowd moved. Dozens of travelers stepped forward in unison, not with aggression, but with fierce determination. They formed an unspoken barrier between the law and the family, their eyes wide but firm, their phones still raised high. It was not just defense, it was defiance. "Stay back," one officer barked, pushing against a middle-aged man in a business suit who didn't flinch. "You stay back," the man replied coolly, holding up his phone. "It's all being recorded." Around them, others echoed the sentiment. "Get this angle," someone whispered. "They'll try to twist it." Kalen, still wincing from the earlier blow, dragged the stroller back toward his father with trembling hands. Jorah whimpered softly, his baby fingers reaching out instinctively for comfort, not fully understanding the chaos around him, but clearly sensing it. Kalen kept his eyes forward, his jaw clenched, his pace steady despite the dull throb in his ribs. Malric remained crouched beside the motionless form of Grady, his hand still braced on the man's broken back, not in cruelty but in deliberate control. His breathing was steady, but his eyes scanned every movement around them with silent precision. His body, though coiled with readiness, held no aggression now, only resolve. Lieutenant Strass stood at a distance, unmoving, a conflict waging war behind his weathered eyes. The scene before him was raw and undeniable. He had warned about Grady's behavior for months, but no one had listened. And now, the fallout of that negligence sprawled before him like a crime scene written in pride and bruised authority. His lips parted, as if to call for calm, but his voice caught in his throat. Darren, still shaken, forced himself forward. His face was pale, lips pressed tight, and one hand instinctively hovered near the taser strapped to his belt. But his movements were cautious now, unsure. The sight of Malric, calm, unshaken, and surrounded by citizens who stood with him, was no longer just intimidating. It was dangerous in a way Darren hadn't faced before. "He's dangerous," Darren shouted, his voice cracking through the din. He pointed a trembling finger at Malric. "He attacked an officer. He's unstable." But the irony of his words burned hotter than anything else in the room. The danger hadn't come from Malric. It had come from the cruelty, the arrogance, and the unchecked power that Darren and Grady had wielded like weapons. And now, with the tables turned and the entire terminal watching, Darren's voice lacked the authority it once held. His words rang hollow. Malric slowly turned his head toward Darren. His expression was unreadable, but his eyes held a weight that made the younger officer falter. "I didn't attack," Malric said quietly. "I defended." Kalen reached his side then, placing the stroller behind his father and stepping forward, his fists clenched at his sides. Though his breath came in short bursts and a bruise was forming near his temple, he stood tall. He didn't speak, but his presence spoke louder than words. The surrounding crowd remained silent, reverent almost. Every camera stayed fixed on Malric, on Darren, on the tension hanging by a thread. Whispers rose among them, but they were no longer whispers of panic. They were statements of truth. "He's protecting his kid," someone said. "I saw the punch." "That officer hit the boy first," said another. "Can't hide this," a voice near the back murmured. "The whole world's going to see it." The hum of approaching sirens could be heard faintly beyond the terminal walls, a sign that more authorities were on the way. But none dared move yet. It wasn't time. Malric, feeling the weight of 100 eyes, took a deep breath and did the one thing no one expected. He let go. He slowly removed his hand from Grady's back and placed it gently on Jorah's head. The baby calmed almost instantly, his cries softening into tired sniffles as if reassured by the presence of his father. The officers hesitated. Strass finally took a step forward, eyes flicking between his men and the man standing like a sentinel before his children. He could feel the tension vibrating in his bones. One wrong move and the fragile wall of calm would shatter again. But Malric didn't lash out. He didn't speak of revenge or rage. Instead, his voice rose above the stillness, clear and controlled. "We do not bow to broken men." The words dropped into the silence like stone into still water. The crowd stood still. Darren lowered his taser slightly, and even Strass, torn between uniform and humanity, found himself nodding once. What began as humiliation had transformed into a father's battlefield of truth. The first set of boots hit the terminal floor less than 60 seconds after Grady's spine gave way. Uniformed officers poured in from every corridor, their radios crackling with overlapping commands, their hands twitching near holsters. But they were too late. The story had already escaped. Dozens of bystanders held up their phones like torches, capturing every frame, every word, every brutal second. Within minutes, the footage had reached the outer world, shared, reposted, and broadcast with the velocity of fury. Local news anchors, still in their morning suits, interrupted programming to roll the footage. Breaking: confrontation at Drennick International. Civilian father protects children from violent officers. The caption ran beneath a freeze frame of Malric, jaw set, crouched between his sons and the broken remains of the terminal's illusion of order. Outside, protesters gathered before the airport's glass facade like a rising tide. Some carried signs demanding justice. Others shouted through bullhorns about patterns of abuse and silence. The air smelled of asphalt, sweat, and a long overdue reckoning. Inside, Malric Rivers stood still. His hands bore no blood but shook with the kind of weight only a father could carry. A circle of officers surrounded him and his sons, this time, not in hostility, but in wary control. Kaylin limped slightly, still shielding Jorah's stroller as though one last hand might try to reach for it. Ezra whimpered softly under his blanket, the chaos fading to a low hum in his baby ears. A senior officer with silver in his hair and sharp lines around his eyes motioned for the family to be escorted, not cuffed, into a private holding room adjacent to the main hall. 2 guards flanked them, but their hands stayed away from their weapons. Their eyes avoided contact. The room was plain, white walls, a metal table, 2 plastic chairs. A jug of water and 3 paper cups had been placed in the center, untouched. The air conditioning hummed too loudly, and somewhere beyond the walls, the muffled sound of chants filtered in. Malric didn't sit. He stood with one hand resting lightly on the stroller handle, the other pressed against the small of his back, his eyes locked on the metal door. Kaylin sat near the table, a wet cloth held gently to his side. Then the door clicked open. Lieutenant Corvin Strass stepped in. His gray uniform was wrinkled, his cap held loosely in one hand. The weight on his face was visible, not from the years, but from the knowledge that everything he had tried to prevent had unfolded in public view. "Mr. Rivers," he began, voice steady but low. He didn't sit either. "The evidence is complete." Malric said nothing. His silence demanded more. Strass looked at Kaylin, then down at Jorah, before placing his cap on the table with a soft thud. "We have the footage. From the phones, from the station's own cameras, Grady tearing the passport, Darren striking your son, the baton, everything." It's undeniable Kaylin's voice was hoarse when he spoke. "Then why are we still in this room?" Strass's eyes flickered. He stepped closer, careful, like a man walking across thin ice. "Because the higher-ups will try to bury this. You need to understand, they're already working on a narrative. Stress, misunderstanding, miscommunication." Malric's jaw tightened. "Miscommunication doesn't snap bones." "No, it doesn't," Strass agreed. His shoulders dropped slightly as if admitting it aloud cost him something. "I warned them about Grady. Filed reports. None of them stuck. Always someone above saying it wasn't enough." Silence thickened in the room. Jorah stirred, then calmed again as Malric leaned down and gently adjusted the blanket. Strass spoke once more, quieter now. "If I'm being honest, this is bigger than you, Mr. Rivers. It's not just about your sons. The world outside is watching now. That's the only reason this isn't already buried 6 feet deep." Kaylin sat straighter, the fire returning to his eyes. "Then we make sure they keep watching." Strass met Malric's gaze. "Do you want to press charges?" The father didn't answer immediately. He looked at both his sons. The pain behind his eyes softened only by the depth of love he had for them. Then he said, "It's not about revenge. It's about making sure no other child watches his father get mocked for protecting him. It's about making sure no man thinks a badge is permission to shred dignity." Strass nodded slowly. "There'll be pressure. From above, from media, from within. You'll be painted as a threat, a vigilante." "I'm a father," Malric replied, voice even. "That's all I've ever been." Kaylin reached across the table and poured water into the cups with shaking hands. He handed one to his father, who accepted it without a word. There was no comfort in the room, no joy, but there was something stronger, certainty. Strass picked up his cap again and walked to the door. Before leaving, he looked back one last time. "I'll do what I can to make sure this doesn't disappear. But you'll have to fight harder than you ever have." "We're not afraid," Kaylin said softly. Strass hesitated, then exited, the door clicking shut behind him. Malric turned to his son. Their eyes met, and for a moment the room faded. The airport, the violence, the past, it all became background noise. "This was never just about us," Kaylin whispered. "No," Malric agreed, placing his hand over his son's. "It's about what they think they can silence." And then, almost to himself, he added, "Justice cannot live in silence. We will not let them bury us." In that dim room, resolve replaced fear. The courtroom doors swung open with a creak, and the world held its breath. All eyes turned to the defense table as Malric Rivers stepped inside, his tall frame composed, every step deliberate. Kaylin walked beside him, one hand protectively resting on the stroller carrying little Jorah. The polished floors of the High Court of Norfolk County reflected their silhouettes like ghostly echoes of what had happened in that airport terminal. Reporters whispered furiously into their microphones. Jurors shifted in their seats, some already glancing toward the evidence monitor. Tension pressed against the walls like storm clouds ready to burst. At the prosecution's side, Officer Darren Holt fidgeted with his collar, sweat forming at his temples. His shoulders rose and fell rapidly, like a man bracing for judgment he wasn't prepared to face. Grady Vexlin, once so smug and commanding, now sat slumped in a wheelchair, his face drawn and colorless. His hands, wrapped in medical braces, rested on the armrests with stiff discomfort. His jaw clenched at the sight of Malrick, but he said nothing. His bitterness was silent now, festering in the lines of his scowl. The judge called for the opening arguments, but the room barely needed them. The real weight of this trial wasn't in speeches. It was in the viral footage queued for replay. It was in the hushed voices of the nation watching live streams from outside. It was in the undeniable fact that something broke that day. Not just bones, but trust. The first witness was a bystander, a young man named Byron Fells, who had recorded the incident from a nearby terminal cafe. "I was drinking coffee," Byron said, his voice shaking slightly as he addressed the jury. "Then I heard this sound, like paper tearing and a baby crying. When I turned, I saw that officer." He nodded toward Grady. "He ripped the passport. No reason. And then the other one punched the teen. That kid held onto the stroller like it was the only thing keeping him breathing." Byron's hands trembled as he recalled the moment, and his voice cracked. "I recorded it because I knew no one would believe it otherwise." The footage played, the sound clear. A passport tearing, Jorah's sharp, panicked cry, and the dull thud of a fist striking flesh. The jury sat motionless. No one blinked. Next came a janitor, old Mr. Rellan, his gray mustache twitching as he gave his testimony. "I've seen men like Vexlin before. Loud, cruel, always got away with it because of the badge. But that father," he shook his head slowly, "he warned them. With silence." When the defense finally called Malrick to the stand, the courtroom seemed to hold its breath again. He walked slowly, not out of weakness but discipline. Every step, every motion, carried the weight of everything he had endured and everything he still protected. The prosecutor leaned forward. "Mr. Rivers, why didn't you leave when things escalated?" Malrick looked across the courtroom. "Because leaving would have taught my sons that silence is survival." His voice didn't tremble. "But silence didn't save us that day. It nearly cost us everything." Gasps rippled through the room. Kalen watched his father with a mix of awe and quiet fear, knowing what this moment meant. The child inside the stroller, now babbling softly, had no idea how history was reshaping around him. Then came the twist no one expected. Lieutenant Corvin Strass walked toward the witness stand, his shoes echoing on the floor. The courtroom murmured as he took the oath. "I warned the department about Grady Vexlin years ago," he said calmly. "There were complaints. Threats made against travelers. Officers feared him but didn't speak up. I filed internal reports, but nothing changed." The judge leaned forward. "Are you saying the system failed to act?" Strass met the judge's gaze without blinking. "I'm saying the system protected him, until it couldn't anymore." Gasps again. Darren shifted in his chair, his jaw tightening, and Grady looked down, jaw clenched so tightly it seemed his teeth might snap. The tension grew unbearable as the prosecutor approached the final moments of his argument. He raised the tablet. The screen once again played the climax of the footage, Malrick's quiet words, Grady's threats, and then the sickening snap. "You thought paper was power. Let me show you what blood is." The silence afterward wasn't just stunned, it was reverent. When the verdict came down, the courtroom didn't explode in cheers. It didn't need to. The weight of justice landing was loud enough. "On the charges of assault and misconduct, we find the defendants guilty." Grady and Darren were stripped of their badges, their reputations shattered. Grady was sentenced to 5 years with possibility of parole. Darren was handed 3 years and court-mandated anger rehabilitation. The airport authority, facing intense public scrutiny, announced sweeping reforms, mandatory body cams for all officers, monthly conduct reviews, and independent civilian oversight. As the reporters swarmed the courthouse steps, Malrick emerged with his sons. He didn't wave. He didn't speak to the cameras. Instead, he placed one hand gently on Kalen's shoulder and the other on Jorah's head. In that moment, he wasn't a hero, a fighter, or a symbol. He was simply a father. And the world finally saw the truth. Sometimes justice does not arrive in robes, it arrives in the hands of a father. Seconds later, the father struck back. The same hands that ripped a passport felt justice break his power in half. If you stand for protecting the innocent and demanding accountability, subscribe now. Together, we rise. Disclaimer: the story you just watched is fictional. It sheds light on themes of racism, abuse of authority, and the devastating impact unchecked power can have on families. Its purpose is to raise awareness, spark dialogue about systemic injustice, and inspire empathy and action toward accountability and equality.